She sat in the only empty seat. By lunchtime, the entire row was vacant. 2. A classroom silence was her loud desk bully. Her history was the only thing louder. 3. They ignored her for being different. One story from her grandmother changed everything. The fluorescent lights of the Northwood Elementary School hallway hummed a flat, monotonous tune, a sound that felt as sterile and unwelcoming as the freshly waxed linoleum floors. Amara clutched the straps of her brand-new backpack, the stiff fabric a stark contrast to the frantic flutter in her chest. Her mother's final, reassuring words from the car door, "You are sunshine, Amara. Don't you ever let anyone dim your light," seemed 1,000 miles away, a faint echo swallowed by the cavernous newness of it all. This was it. The final week of the Who I Am presentations loomed, a 5-day countdown that felt more like a guillotine than a school project. She had to stand in front of all these strangers, these faces that were still and just a blur of colors and shapes, and explain herself, justify her existence in a space where she already felt like a ghost. The project was supposed to be about celebrating uniqueness, but all Amara wanted was to be invisible. Her sneakers, pristine white and squeaking with every hesitant step, carried her toward room 204, Mrs. Davison's classroom. Through the rectangular glass window in the door, she could see them, the other fifth graders. They were a whirlwind of motion and noise, a chaotic symphony of reunion after a long summer. Laughter bounced off the walls, vibrant and easy. Boys were comparing schedules, girls were showing off new charm bracelets, and a palpable energy of belonging filled the space, an energy that seemed to stop dead at the doorframe where Amara stood. Taking a deep, shaky breath that did little to calm the swarm of butterflies in her stomach, she pushed the heavy door open. The wave of sound washed over her, a mix of chatter, the sharp scent of dry erase markers, and the faint, sweet smell of chalk dust. Heads turned. The laughter didn't stop, but it changed, dipping in volume, laced with a new thread of curiosity. Eyes blue, green, brown flickered over her. They took in her face, her new dress with its pattern of sunflowers, and inevitably, they landed on her hair. Her mother had spent 2 hours the night before weaving magic. Her hair was a crown of intricate braids, each one a testament to patience and love, adorned with bright, sunny yellow beads that matched her dress. At home, in the warm light of her bedroom, they had felt beautiful, powerful. Here, under the cold, humming lights, they felt like a declaration, a bright, flashing sign that screamed, different, different, different. The classroom was arranged in neat rows of desks, all facing the large whiteboard at the front. Most were already occupied, claimed by sprawling backpacks and the easy ownership of familiarity. There was only one empty seat in the entire front row, a perfect, solitary island in a sea of occupied territory. It seemed to beckon to her, a clear and simple solution to the terrifying question of where to go. Squaring her shoulders, Amara navigated the narrow aisle, acutely aware of the pairs of eyes that followed her progress. She could feel their gazes like tiny pinpricks on her skin. She slid into the seat, the smooth plastic cool against her legs. She carefully placed her backpack on the floor beside her, arranging it just so, a small, mundane task to anchor herself in the swirling vortex of her anxiety. The desk was a blank slate of polished wood, scarred with the faint etchings of previous students. She traced a looping J with her fingertip, focusing on the imperfection, on anything other than the whispers that had begun to sprout in the row behind her like insidious weeds. Look at her hair. A girl's voice, hushed but sharp, sliced through the general din. It's so bright, a boy added, the word bright stretched out as if it were a foreign concept. Then, the word that landed like a stone in her gut, she looks different. It wasn't said with overt malice. It was a statement of fact, a simple observation, but it carried the weight of a judgment. Amara's shoulders tightened. She stared straight ahead at the whiteboard, willing herself not to react, to become as smooth and impassive as the desk in front of her. She could feel the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. A chair scraped against the floor. Another. She didn't dare turn around, But she knew. She could feel the void growing around her. The boy who had been sitting directly behind her had moved, sliding his desk a few inches to the left. The girl next to him followed suit. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible migration, a silent consensus that created a pocket of empty space, a quarantine zone with Amara at its epicenter. The seats around her, once just unoccupied, now felt deliberately, painfully, empty. The first day had barely begun, and she was already an island. Mrs. Davison bustled in then, a whirlwind of floral print and warm, crinkly smiles. "Good morning, fifth graders, welcome back," she chirped, her voice cutting through the tension Amara felt suffocating her. The class responded with a chorus of greetings, their attention shifting to the front, but Amara couldn't shake the feeling. The empty space around her was a physical presence, a cold draft in the otherwise warm room. It was a silence that was louder than any insult, a quiet exclusion that had already defined her place in this new world before she'd even had a chance to say her own name. The deadline for the Who I Am presentation felt less like a week and more like a lifetime away. How could she possibly stand up and explain who she was to a room that had already decided she didn't belong? The morning crawled by in a blur of introductions and classroom rules. Mrs. Davison was kind, her eyes sweeping over the class with an encouraging light. Amara felt a brief flicker of hope when the teacher's gaze met hers. She offered a small, genuine smile that didn't seem to notice the moat of empty floor around Amara's desk. But the feeling was fleeting. Every time she risked a glance to her side or behind her, the emptiness was there, a stark reminder of her isolation. During a group icebreaker, where they were supposed to find a partner and share their favorite summer memory, Amara was the last one left, a solitary statue in a flurry of pairing and chatter. Mrs. Davison had to gently assign her to a pair of girls, Chloe and Jessica, who already seemed to be best friends. They turned to her, their smiles tight and fleeting. "Hi," Amara had said, her voice barely a whisper. "Hey," Chloe replied, her eyes already drifting back to Jessica. Amara told them about her trip to the city to see her grandmother, Nana Rose. She spoke of the heat rising from the pavement and the taste of the sweet iced tea her Nana made. They listened with polite detachment, their bodies angled away from her, their shared glances creating a private conversation she wasn't privy to. When it was their turn, they spoke of a shared trip to a lake house, their words tumbling over each other in an excited rush, filled with inside jokes and memories that built a wall around them. Amara simply nodded, the story of her summer feeling small and insignificant in the face of their impenetrable bond. The bell for lunch was a merciful release. She followed the river of students flowing into the cafeteria, the roar of 100 conversations hitting her like a physical force. The air was thick with the smell of greasy pizza and lukewarm milk. She moved through the line on autopilot, her tray feeling heavy and awkward in her hands. Her eyes scanned the vast expanse of long tables, searching for a friendly face, an open invitation. What she found was a landscape of established territories. Tables of loud, boisterous boys, tables of whispering girls, their heads bent close together. Groups had already formed, solidifying friendships from years past. She spotted Chloe and Jessica at a table near the window, a spot they had clearly saved for their friends. There was an empty space, but it felt a million miles away. She saw the boy who had sat behind her, Jake, holding court at a table full of other boys, reenacting some video game move to peals of laughter. There was no room for her there. Her heart sinking with each step, she finally found an unoccupied table at the far end of the cafeteria, near the humming drink machines. The location felt symbolic, pushed to the periphery. She sat down, the plastic bench cold beneath her. She arranged her food meticulously on the tray, a slice of pepperoni pizza, a small carton of chocolate milk, a wobbly cup of green jello. The silence at her table was a stark contrast to the cacophony around her. It pressed in on her, amplifying the clatter of silverware from other tables, the shrieks of laughter, the low hum of conversation. It was a silence that made her feel deafeningly conspicuous. She took a small bite of her pizza, the cheese stringy and tasteless in her mouth. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, though she knew, rationally, that no one was likely paying her any attention at all. That was the problem. She was so completely, utterly invisible that it made her feel hypervisible. She risked a glance up. A few tables away, a boy named Liam, who had been quiet in class, was watching her. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He had kind eyes, a scattering of freckles across his nose. The classroom erupted in a controlled chaos of scraping chairs and excited chatter. It was the partner icebreaker all over again, but on a larger, more humiliating scale. Amara stayed rooted to her seat, her body frozen. She watched as hands were raised, friends were beckoned, and groups formed with swift, practiced efficiency. Within 30 seconds, the room had reconfigured itself into bustling pods of collaboration. All except for her. She was still an island, the empty desks around her a testament to her otherness. The seconds stretched into an eternity. She could feel Mrs. Davison's eyes on her, a gentle, concerned pressure. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Finally, the teacher's voice cut through her private misery. Liam, Jake, you boys have room for one more. Amara, why don't you join them? It was meant to be helpful, an act of inclusion, but it felt like a spotlight. Every head in the vicinity turned to look at her as she picked up her notebook and pencil and walked along, lonely 10 feet to their cluster of desks. Jake sighed, a theatrical, put upon sound. Liam, at least, had the grace to look embarrassed. He pulled an extra chair over for her, his movements stiff and awkward. Hi, Amara said again, her voice even smaller than before. Hey, Liam mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Jake just grunted, his attention fixed on doodling a superhero in his notebook. The brainstorming session was excruciating. Liam talked about his grandfather, who had been a firefighter, and how he wanted to bring in his old helmet for his presentation. Jake scoffed. That's kind of boring. Man, Jake said, not looking up from his drawing. Old people stuff. Liam's face fell. It is not. He saved people. Whatever. I'm doing my presentation on my all-star soccer team. We won the championship. I'm gonna bring the trophy. He puffed out his chest slightly, the picture of self-satisfaction. He turned to Amara, his gaze dismissive. What about you? Got any trophies? Amara shook her head, her throat tight. No, she whispered. No trophies. Figured, Jake muttered, turning back to his drawing. The message was clear. Her value, her uniqueness, was being measured by a standard she couldn't meet. Her world felt small and uninteresting compared to their championship trophies and heroic grandfathers. What did she have? Stories. Her Nana Rose's stories. Stories of marches, of sitting at counters where she wasn't welcome, of singing freedom songs in the back of a police wagon. In her own home, these stories were treasures, epic tales of courage and conviction. Here, in this classroom, in the face of Jake's casual disdain for old people stuff, they suddenly felt like liabilities. They were the very things that made her different, the root of the whispers and the empty seats. Sharing them felt less like an act of celebration and more like an invitation for further ridicule. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. Amara packed her bag with a speed born of desperation, eager to escape the suffocating confines of the classroom. As she bolted for the door, she heard Liam's voice behind her. Hey, wait. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and turned. Liam was standing there, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Jake was already gone. Don't listen to him, Liam said, his voice low. He's a jerk sometimes. Your hair is cool, he said the last part in a rush, his cheeks turning a bright pink. He then quickly turned and hurried away, as if the admission had burned his tongue. Amara stood there for a moment, stunned. It was a small gesture, a tiny crack in the wall of indifference, but it wasn't enough to fill the vast emptiness she felt inside. As she walked home, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the sidewalk, the single word echoed in her mind, cool. It was a word of acceptance, but it felt thin and hollow. He thought her hair was cool, but he hadn't sat with her. He had defended her from Jake, but only after Jake was gone. He had noticed her, but from a safe distance. The quiet exclusion continued, and the Friday deadline for her presentation felt like it was racing toward her, a day of reckoning she was completely unprepared for. The next 2 days were a master class in quiet agony. Tuesday and Wednesday unfolded with a crushing sameness. In the morning, the empty seats around her remained. At lunch, her table was a solitary island. During recess, the playground became a landscape of exclusion. She would watch the other kids play foursquare, their laughter echoing across the blacktop. She'd drift towards the game, a hopeful question on her lips, but they would turn their backs, engrossed in their play, creating a subtle but impenetrable barrier. She tried the swings, but the girls already there would start whispering, their conversation dying whenever she got too close. She spent most of her recess time walking the perimeter of the playground, tracing the chain link fence with her fingers, feeling as caged in as the schoolyard itself. In class, the group project with Liam and Jake was a source of constant, low-grade dread. Jake ignored her completely, occasionally making snide remarks about her quietness. "Cat got your tongue," he'd sneer, without looking at her. Liam remained a frustrating enigma. He would sometimes offer her a small, furtive smile when Jake wasn't looking, and he once passed her a crayon she had dropped, their fingers brushing for a fleeting moment. But he never engaged her in real conversation. He was a silent, uncomfortable witness, his kindness too timid to breach the wall of peer pressure Jake had erected. The weight of the Who I Am presentation grew heavier with each passing hour. The project was all anyone talked about. Chloe was bringing in her ribbon-winning horse-riding helmet. A boy named Sam was going to demonstrate a magic trick his uncle had taught him. Jessica was showing a video of her family's trip to the Grand Canyon. Each idea was a polished, shiny testament to a life that felt normal, accepted, and interesting. Amara's own ideas felt like jagged, dangerous rocks. She thought about talking about her love for drawing, but she didn't have any awards to show for it. She considered her pet hamster, Pip, but it felt childish compared to championship trophies and heroic grandfathers. Every safe option felt like a lie, a carefully constructed mask to hide the things that truly defined her. And the one thing that felt most true, the legacy of Nana Rose, felt the most dangerous. On Wednesday afternoon, Mrs. Davison checked in with each group about their presentation progress. When she arrived at their cluster, she smiled warmly. "So, what have we decided?" she asked. Jake immediately launched into a detailed description of his soccer trophy. Liam mumbled something about still trying to find his grandfather's helmet. Then, all eyes turned to Amara. The silence stretched, thick and expectant. "Amara," Mrs. Davison prompted gently. I'm still thinking," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the scarred surface of her desk. She could feel Jake's smirk without even looking at him. The teacher's encouraging smile faltered for a second, replaced by a flicker of concern, but she moved on to the next group, leaving Amara to drown in her own indecision. That evening, the feeling of dread followed her home. She sat at the kitchen table, pushing her green beans around her plate, the silence of her own home a mirror of the silence at her lunch table. Her mother, ever perceptive, sat down opposite her, her face etched with worrying. "Talk to me, sweet pea," her mom said, her voice soft. "You've been quiet as a mouse since school started. Is everything okay?" The question opened a floodgate. The tears she had been holding back for 3 days finally broke free, silent at first, then turning into ragged, hiccuping sobs. Her mom was around the table in an instant, wrapping her in a warm, strong hug that smelled of cinnamon and laundry detergent. Amara buried her face in her mother's shoulder and let it all out, the whispers, the empty seats, the lonely lunches, Jake's meanness, Liam's confusing half-kindness, and the terrifying weight of the presentation. "They think I'm weird," she sobbed, her words muffled. "They all moved away from me. No one will even talk to me, and now I have to stand up in front of all of them on Friday and what? Tell them more things to think are weird. Her mother held her, stroking her braids, until the storm of tears subsided into a light drizzle. She pulled back, wiping Amara's cheeks with her thumbs. "Oh, baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Being different isn't the same as being weird, and being quiet doesn't mean you don't have anything to say." She paused, her eyes searching Amara's. "What were you thinking of talking about for your presentation?" "I don't know," Amara mumbled, though it was a lie. She knew exactly what she wanted to talk about. Maybe Pip the hamster. Her mom raised an eyebrow. Pip the hamster, or Nana Rose. Amara's breath hitched. Her mom always knew. Nana's stories are there for us. They won't understand. They'll us think it's more old people stuff. The phrase tasted bitter in her mouth. Her mother was silent for a long moment, then she stood up and left the room, returning with a small, velvet-lined box. It was her jewelry box, but Amara knew it held more than just jewelry. Her mom opened it and carefully took out a small, smooth, dark gray stone. It was flat and oval-shaped, worn down by time and touch. "You know what this is," her mom said, placing it in Amara's palm. Amara closed her fingers around it. The stone was cool and solid, a familiar weight. It was Nana Rose's whirring stone. Her grandmother had given it to her years ago. She picked this up from a street in Birmingham, Alabama. Her mom recited the familiar story, her voice like a gentle hymn, right after the march. She held it in her hand the whole time she was in the jail cell. She said it reminded her that the world is hard and sharp, but you can find things that are smooth and strong to hold on to. Amara clutched the stone. This was Chekhov's gun, though she didn't know the term. It was a tangible piece of the story, a direct link to the courage she so desperately needed. "Your Nana and the people who marched with her," her mom continued, her voice gaining strength. "They faced more than just empty seats, Amara. They faced dogs and fire hoses and people full of so much hate. They did it so that their children, and their children's children, could walk into any school, sit in any seat, and not have to be afraid." She looked directly into Amara's eyes, her gaze unwavering. "Their story in old people stuff. It's your stuff. It's the reason you are sitting in that classroom at all. It's not weird. It's your legacy. It's your strength." Amara looked down at the stone in her hand. Her mother's words settled deep inside her, not erasing the fear, but giving her something solid to stand on. She thought about Liam's grandfather, the firefighter. He was a hero because he ran into burning buildings to save people. Her Nana Rose was a hero, too. She had run into the fire of hatred to save a future she couldn't even fully imagine. It was then that something shifted in Amara's understanding. She had been so focused on the children's rejection of her, she hadn't considered the source. Jake's dismissal of Liam's grandfather wasn't just mean, it was ignorant. He couldn't see the heroism because he was too focused on the old. Perhaps their rejection of her wasn't just about her braids or the color of her skin. Maybe it was about their own small worlds, their own lack of understanding. They weren't just being cruel, they were being blind. The problem wasn't that she was different. The problem was that they couldn't see, and maybe, just maybe, her presentation was a chance to make them see. This realization was the story's midpoint twist. It wasn't a dramatic external event, but a profound internal shift. Her goal was no longer just to survive the presentation, or to try and fit in. Her goal was now to make them understand. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was accompanied by a tiny, flickering flame of purpose. She wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. She was the keeper of a story that needed to be told. The stakes had changed. It wasn't just about her own acceptance anymore. It was about honoring the legacy that lived in the palm of her hand. She looked up at her mother, her eyes still red-rimmed but now clear and determined. "Okay," she said, her voice small but steady. "I'll talk about Nana Rose." Thursday was a day of quiet preparation. The anxiety was still a constant companion, a humming under her skin, but it was different now. It was the nervous energy of an actor before a performance, not the paralyzing dread of a victim awaiting her fate. At school, she was still an island. The seats were still empty. The lunch table was still silent, but Amara observed it all with a new perspective. She saw the other kids not as a monolithic jury, but as an audience that simply hadn't been told the right story yet. She spent the school day replaying her Nana's stories in her head, not just the facts, but the feelings. She remembered Nana describing the oppressive, sticky heat of a southern summer day, the scratchy wool of the dress she wore to the sit-in, the way the protest songs would start as a low hum and swell into a chorus that could shake the very foundations of injustice. She remembered the taste of fear, which Nana said was like metal on the tongue, and the feeling of hope, which was like a cool drink of water after a long, thirsty march. That night, she didn't write a script. A story like this couldn't be read from a piece of paper. It had to be told from the heart. She sat on her bed, the whirring stone clutched in her hand, and she practiced. She spoke to her stuffed animals, arranged in a row on her pillow. She told them about the whites' only signs that were like poison ivy, tainting everything they touched. She told them about the bravery it took to just sit down at a lunch counter and ask for a cup of coffee. She told them about her grandmother, a young woman then, with fear in her heart but a fire in her soul, linking arms with her friends and singing "We Shall Overcome" as the police wagons pulled up. Her mom stood in the doorway, listening, her eyes shining with tears and pride. She didn't interrupt, she simply bore witness. The crisis, the final hard choice, came just before bed. As her mom tucked her in, she smoothed Amara's hair back from her forehead. "Are you sure, sweet pea?" she asked, her voice gentle. "You don't have to do this. You could talk about your drawings. You could tell them about your trip to the zoo. There is no shame in choosing an easier path." It was a final, loving offer of an escape route. The choice was laid bare before Amara. She could retreat to the safety of the mundane, the universally acceptable topics of pets and hobbies. She could try to build a bridge to the other kids by being more like them. It would be easy. It would be safe. No one would call a story about a hamster old people stuff. Or she could walk the path of fire. She could stand before them, vulnerable and authentic, and share the very core of what made her different, risking their judgment, their misunderstanding, their ridicule. It was a choice between hiding for a chance at acceptance, or standing in her truth for the sake of her own integrity, and for the honor of her grandmother. Amara's fingers tightened around the whirring stone under her pillow. She thought of Nana Rose, sitting in that jail cell. She hadn't chosen the easier path, she had chosen the right one. "I'm sure, Mom," Amara said, her voice clear and without a trace of doubt. "Nana was brave for me. Now I have to be brave for her." Friday morning arrived, gray and overcast, the sky mirroring the nervous churning in Amara's stomach. She put on her favorite dress, the one with the sunflowers, a small act of defiance. Her mom braided a few new yellow beads into her hair, each one feeling like a tiny orb of courage. In her pocket, the whirring stone was a solid, reassuring weight. The school day passed in a torturous, slow-motion crawl. The presentations were scheduled for the last period of the day. Every tick of the classroom clock was a drumbeat counting down to her moment of truth. She could barely focus on her math lesson, the numbers swimming before her eyes. At lunch, she couldn't eat a single bite, her stomach a tight knot of nerves. Finally, the last period arrived. The classroom buzzed with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Mrs. Davison called the first student up. It was Chloe, who confidently showed off her equestrian helmet and told a funny story about falling off her horse. The class laughed. Next was Sam, who fumbled his magic trick but earned a round of applause for his effort. Then Jake strode to the front, placing his gleaming gold soccer trophy on the teacher's desk with a resounding thud. He recounted his team's victory with dramatic flair, and the boys in the class hooted in appreciation. One by one, they shared their pieces of themselves, a collection of rare bottle caps, a demonstration of ballet positions, a photo album from a trip to Disney World. Each presentation was a glimpse into a life, polished and presentable. With each one, Amara felt her own story growing larger and more unwieldy, a thing of jagged edges and uncomfortable truths that wouldn't fit neatly into a 5-minute slot. And for our final presentation, Mrs. Davison said, her eyes finding Amara, "We have Amara." A hush fell over the room. It was the same heavy, watchful silence that had greeted her on the first day. Amara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her palms were slick with sweat. For a terrifying second, her courage deserted her. She couldn't move. She thought of her mother's escape route. You could talk about Pip the hamster. The thought was a siren song, promising safety. But then, her fingers found the stone in her pocket. It was cool and smooth against her damp skin. The world is hard and sharp, but you can find things that are smooth and strong to hold on to. Nana's courage flowed into her, a quiet, steadying current. She pushed her chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the silent room, and walked to the front. She stood before them, a small girl in a sunflower dress, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't look at their faces, not yet. She looked at the scuffed toes of her shoes. She took a deep breath. "My who I am presentation, in about a trophy," she began, her voice a reedy whisper that she prayed wouldn't crack. "And it's not about a pet or a vacation. It's about a story. It's about my grandmother." Nana rose. She chanced to look up. Jake was already rolling his eyes. A few other kids were fidgeting, but Liam was watching her, his expression unreadable. She pressed on, her voice gaining a little strength. "When my grandmother was not much older than we are now, she lived in a world that had signs everywhere. Signs that told her where she could and couldn't drink water, where she could and couldn't sit on a bus, where she could and couldn't go to school." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. The fidgeting began to subside. One day, she and her friends decided they were tired of the signs. So they did something very simple and very brave. They walked into a diner, a place they weren't allowed, and they sat down at the lunch counter. They didn't yell. They didn't break anything. They just sat. They said that all they wanted was to be served a cup of coffee, just like everyone else. She described the scene as Nana had described it to her, using all the senses. The smell of stale coffee and grease, the sight of the angry, twisted faces of the white patrons, the feeling of the cold, smooth countertop under their hands, the sound of the insults being hurled at them, words like sharp, ugly stones. People yelled at them, Amara said, her voice dropping lower. They dumped ketchup on their heads. They called them names I'm not allowed to repeat. But my grandmother and her friends didn't move. They just sat there, holding onto a belief that everyone deserves a seat at the table. The room was completely still now. Even Jake had stopped his eye rolling, his pen frozen above his notebook. "The police came," Amara continued, her voice trembling with the weight of the story. "They arrested her." My Nana rose. "They put her in a jail cell. She told me the floor was cold and hard, and she was so scared. But she also told me that she sang. She and the other kids in the cells. They sang freedom songs. Their voices filled up the darkness." Amara's own eyes were filling with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. This was too important. She wasn't a criminal. She hadn't stolen anything or hurt anyone. Her only crime was wanting the same rights as everyone else, the right to sit wherever she wanted. She let that sentence resonate in the profound silence. Then she looked up, and for the first time, she looked directly at the faces of her classmates. She looked at the empty desk to her right, and the empty one behind it. "My grandmother sat on a hard, cold jail cell floor," she said, her voice clear and ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed, "so that I could have the right to sit in any seat I wanted in this classroom." The connection was undeniable, a sudden, blinding flash of light in the dim room. You could see the understanding dawn on their faces, the slow, uncomfortable shifting in their seats as the meaning of their quiet, thoughtless actions was laid bare. Then, Amara reached into her pocket. She pulled out the smooth, gray-wearing stone. This was the payoff. "She picked this up from the street in Birmingham right before they arrested her," she said, holding it up for them to see. It looked small and ordinary in her hand. "She gave it to me to remind me that being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right, even when you are terrified. It's to remind me that my seat in this room was paid for at a very high price. She finished. The silence that followed was nothing like the silence she had known before. It wasn't the silence of exclusion or indifference. It was a heavy, breathless silence, thick with shock and shame, and a dawning, terrible empathy. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stared at her, at the small stone in her hand, their expressions a mixture of awe and regret. Then, from the back of the room, a voice broke the stillness. It was Liam. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at his own desk, his face a deep, burning red. He spoke quietly, but in the absolute silence, his words were as clear as a bell. "Why didn't we sit with you?" He wasn't asking her. He was asking himself. He was asking the whole room. It was a question that hung in the air, a confession and an accusation all in one. And in that moment, Amara knew she had done more than just give a presentation. She had made them see. The bell shrieked, jarring and loud, shattering the moment. Chairs scraped. Backpacks were zipped. The spell was broken. But the question remained, echoing in the sudden chaos of dismissal. The weekend was a quiet respite, a time for the echoes of Friday to settle. Amara felt lighter than she had in weeks, as if she had set down a burden she hadn't even realized she was carrying. She hadn't just told her grandmother's story, she had claimed it as her own. Whatever happened on Monday, she knew she had stood in her truth. When Monday morning arrived, she walked to school with a sense of calm rather than dread. The knot of anxiety in her stomach was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of readiness. She didn't know what to expect, an apology, more silence. She prepared herself for anything. She walked into room 204. A few kids glanced at her, then quickly looked away, a new shyness in their eyes. She made her way to her seat in the front row. The desk next to her was no longer empty. Sarah, a quiet girl with glasses who had presented on her rock collection, was sitting there. She gave Amara a small, shy smile. "Hi," Sarah said. "Hi," Amara replied, a real smile spreading across her face. It was a start. The real test, she knew, would be the cafeteria. As the lunch bell rang, she felt a familiar flicker of apprehension. She got her tray and scanned the room. She found her usual table at the far end, steeling herself for another solitary meal. But the table wasn't empty. Liam was sitting there. He wasn't looking at the door, but he had deliberately taken the seat opposite hers. Leaving the spot beside him open, he had saved her a seat. As she approached, he looked up, his cheeks coloring slightly. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she answered, her heart giving a little leap. She sat down, placing her tray on the table. For a moment, they sat in an awkward but not unpleasant silence. Then, another tray clattered onto the table. It was Sarah. She sat down next to Liam. A moment later, another boy, Sam the magician, joined them. "That was a really good story," Sam said, fumbling with his milk carton, "on Friday." "Yeah," Liam agreed, finally meeting her eyes. "My grandpa. He would have thought your grandma was really brave." He paused, then asked, Can we see the stone again?" Amara's smile was genuine and wide. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the smooth, gray stone. She placed it in the center of the table. It sat there, a simple, unassuming object, but to the four of them, it was a monument. A reminder, a beginning. It wasn't a magical transformation. Jake still sat with his friends across the cafeteria, occasionally glancing over with a look of sullen confusion. Chloe and Jessica still had their own table, their own world. The entire class didn't suddenly become her best friends, but the empty seat was no longer empty. The silence had been filled, not with noise, but with connection. The quiet, insidious poison of exclusion had been met with the powerful antidote of a story, and the simple, courageous choice of one boy to ask a question and then to do better. Amara looked at her new companions, at the whirring stone sitting between them, and felt the warm, brilliant glow of her own light, undimmed, She was home. The bell shrieked, a metal claw raking across the fragile peace of the moment. It was an ugly, industrial sound, designed to command and scatter, and it did its job perfectly. Students scraped chairs back, the collective sigh of 100 bodies released from the forced stillness of lunchtime. The bubble of warmth around their table popped. Liam flinched, his hand instinctively going to his bag. Noah blinked, as if waking from a pleasant dream. "Well," he said, his voice a little rough, "I guess that's it." The journey back to the lockers was a different kind of trial. The cafeteria had been a wide, open space, but the hallways were a churning river of bodies, a gauntlet of shoulders and backpacks and judging eyes. Amara felt the shift instantly. The connection she'd felt with Noah and Liam was a small, warm flame, and the hallway was a cold, rushing wind threatening to snuff it out. She saw Jake ahead, huddled with his friends. He turned, his eyes finding hers, and the sullen confusion had hardened into something colder, something that looked like resentment. He felt foolish, and he had decided it was her fault. He muttered something to the boy next to him, who snickered and glanced back at Amara's group. The poison wasn't gone, it had just been forced to find new channels. "Don't look," Noah said, his voice low. He positioned himself slightly to Amara's left, a subtle but deliberate shield. Liam, on her other side, seemed to draw into himself, his shoulders hunching as if to make a smaller target. The three of them walked in a tight, defensive formation. They passed Chloe and Jessica, who were leaning against a locker, holding court. Chloe's eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over them. She didn't sneer or laugh, it was worse. She assessed them, the way a biologist might observe a new and unexpected species interaction. A flicker of something annoyance, curiosity, crossed her face before she turned back to her friends, dismissing them completely. That dismissal felt more potent than any insult. It was a reminder of the school's uncheckable hierarchy, a system where they were, at best, a momentary diversion. As they neared their next class, a strange cold spot seemed to bloom in the middle of the crowded hall. It was a pocket of unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the school's ancient air conditioning. Amara's breath misted for a second, and the hairs on her arms stood up. She glanced at the whirring stone, which she'd slipped into her pocket. Through the thin fabric of her jeans, she could feel a faint, rhythmic coolness, like a slow, sleeping heartbeat. The cold in the hall was different, it was dead, it was hungry. A freshman, jostled by the crowd, stumbled and dropped his books. As he bent to pick them up, someone Amara couldn't see who kicked one of the books, sending it skittering down the hall. A few students laughed. The freshman's face crumpled in humiliation, a silent, exquisite agony. The cold spot in the hall seemed to deepen, to feed on that small, sharp spike of misery. Amara froze, watching. The entity, the shadow, whatever it wasn't just after her, it was an opportunist. It fed on every casual cruelty, every jab of exclusion, every moment of isolating shame. The school was a feast. Her own experience was just one course on a vast and varied menu. "Come on," Liam urged, his voice tight with anxiety. "We're going to be late." He was right. They had one more class before Mr. Harrison's. English, with Mrs. Davison. The irony was not lost on Amara. The teacher who had inadvertently set this all in motion would be the last one they saw before the final confrontation. They slipped into the classroom just as the second bell rang. Mrs. Davison was already at the front of the room, a book of poetry in her hand. She was a kind woman, with tired eyes that suggested she saw more than she let on, but often didn't know what to do about it. She gave them a small, encouraging smile as they found their seats. Amara sat between Noah and Liam, the three of them forming a small island in the sea of desks. "All right, class," Mrs. Davison began. "Before we discuss Frost, a quick reminder that your big history presentations are last period. I hope you're all feeling prepared. Remember, confidence is key." A low murmur went through the room. A few students exchanged nervous glances. Jake, to rows ahead, cracked his knuckles with an obnoxious loudness. Amara's stomach twisted itself into a tight, painful knot. Confidence. It felt like a foreign country she'd never be able to visit. She slipped her hand into her pocket, her fingers closing around the whirring stone. It was still cool, but the rhythmic pulse was gone. It felt inert, like a normal stone. Had she imagined it all? Was the warmth at lunch, the feeling of connection, just a temporary reprieve before the inevitable disaster? Noah must have seen the doubt on her face. He leaned over, pretending to look at her textbook. "It's still real," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What happened at lunch? It's real." Liam, on her other side, slid a folded piece of notebook paper onto her desk. On it, he'd written in his neat, blocky handwriting, "What's the plan?" "We can't just tell the story about the stone." He was right. Their presentation was supposed to be about the historical significance of local landmarks. They had slides. They had note cards. They had a script they'd half-heartedly rehearsed. How could they possibly pivot from the architectural history of the old mill to a magical rock fought a despaired demon in the cafeteria? They'd be laughed out of the room. Worse, they'd be sent to the school counselor for a mandatory evaluation. Amara looked at Liam's note, then at Noah's reassuring face. The fear was a physical thing, a cold weight in her chest. But underneath it, the memory of that light, her light, still flickered. It was small and fragile, but it was there. She remembered the story of the stone, how it wasn't about fighting the darkness head-on, but about holding a space for the light. It didn't banish the shadows, it made them irrelevant. Maybe that was the answer. She took her pen and wrote on the paper, pushing it back toward Liam. We do both." Liam read it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He wrote back, "How?" Before Amara could answer, Mrs. Davison's voice cut through their silent conference. "Amara, is there something you'd like to share with the class about Robert Frost's mending wall?" Amara's head snapped up. Every eye was on her. For a terrifying second, her mind was a complete blank. The poem, mending wall, something there. She scrambled, her mind racing. And then the words came, prompted by the very problem she was trying to solve. "He says, something there is that doesn't love a wall," she began, her voice a little shaky, "that it wants the wall to come down. But the poem is also about how the neighbors keep rebuilding it every spring. They use it to define their territory, to say, 'I'm here, and you're there.' It's about how sometimes the things we build to protect ourselves are the same things that keep us apart." She finished, her heart pounding. The words had come from somewhere deep and true. She looked around the room. Most of the students were just staring, waiting for the teacher to move on. But Mrs. Davison was looking at her with a new intensity. She saw the connection Amara was making. Jake shot a venomous glare over his shoulder, and Chloe, for the first time, looked at Amara not with dismissal, but with a sharp, calculating interest. Mrs. Davison nodded slowly. "An excellent point, Amara, a very insightful reading. Good fences make good neighbors. A simple phrase, but Frost makes us question it, doesn't he?" The teacher turned back to the board, but the moment lingered. Amara felt a tiny spark of the confidence Mrs. Davison had been talking about. She hadn't just answered a question. She had spoken her truth, cloaked in the safety of a literary analysis. She scribbled furiously on the note, passing it back to Liam and Noah. "We start with the project, the old mill, the history. But the theme of our project isn't just the building. It's about what it represented. A center of the community, a place where people came together. We talk about how, when it closed down, the town lost something, a connection. Then we bring it to the present. We talk about the walls we build now. Not with stones, but with other things. We talk about the importance of community, of having a place to belong. We don't have to mention the stone by name. We just have to tell its story, the story of what it does." Noah read the note, and a slow grin spread across his face. He gave a sharp, decisive nod. Liam looked more hesitant. It was a huge risk. Their grade, their reputation, everything was on the line. He looked from the note to Amara, his eyes full of fear. But then he looked at Noah, and at the determined set of Amara's jaw. He took a deep breath and gave a small, jerky nod of his own. The alliance was holding. The rest of the class passed in a blur of anxiety. Amara couldn't focus on Robert Frost. Her mind was racing, rewriting their presentation, finding the seams where they could weave in the truth. It felt dangerous and reckless and absolutely necessary. The final bell of the day rang, signaling the end of English and the start of the last period. The sound was not a shriek this time, it was a toll, a somber announcement that the time had come. As they gathered their things, Amara felt that unnatural chill again, stronger this time. It seemed to emanate from the back corner of the classroom, a place where the fluorescent lights didn't quite reach. For a split second, she thought she saw the shadows there deepen, coalesce into something vaguely man-shaped, a silhouette of absolute emptiness. She blinked, and it was gone. It was just a corner, filled with old bookshelves and stacked boxes, but the feeling remained. A cold, predatory stillness. It was waiting for them. It knew the final act was about to begin. They walked to Mr. Harrison's history class in silence, the weight of their decision settling upon them. They were no longer just 3 students going to give a presentation. They were walking into an arena. The history room was already buzzing with nervous energy. Mr. Harrison, a perpetually flustered man whose passion for history was constantly at war with his inability to control a classroom, was trying to get the projector to work. Settle down, he chirped, fiddling with the cable. We have a lot to get through. The order of presentations is on the board. Amara's eyes scanned the list. Her heart sank. 1. Chloe, Jessica, and Maya. 2. Jake, Kevin, and Ben. 3. Amara, Noah, and Liam. They were right after Jake. A trial by fire, followed by a public execution. It felt like the schedule had been deliberately designed for maximum humiliation. Chloe's group went first. Their presentation was on the founding of the town library. It was flawless. The slides were beautiful. The research was impeccable, and Chloe spoke with an easy, unshakable confidence that held the entire class in thrall. She used humor and perfectly timed pauses, her charisma a tangible force in the room. They finished to a round of genuine applause. Mr. Harrison beamed. A plus work. Ladies, a plus. That's the standard. People. The bar had been set impossibly high. Then it was Jake's turn. He swaggered to the front of the room, flanked by his 2 friends. Their topic was the high school's own history, focusing on its championship-winning sports teams. The presentation was loud, full of flashy graphics and clips of old football games. Jake did most of the talking, his voice dripping with a manufactured, jockish bravado. He kept making inside jokes with his friends, creating a small, exclusive circle of laughter at the front of the room. It was a presentation about school spirit that was, at its core, deeply exclusionary. Amara felt the cold in the room intensify. The entity was enjoying this. Jake was building walls, and the shadow was growing stronger in their shade. He was radiating a kind of arrogant insecurity that was pure poison, and it was spreading. Students who weren't in his circle shifted uncomfortably. The air grew thick with unspoken resentments and anxieties. Jake ended with a slide featuring a photo of their current football team. And that tradition of excellence continues, he said, puffing out his chest. Then he looked at his list. All right, up next. Amara, Noah, and Liam. This was it. Amara's legs felt like lead as she stood up. Noah gave her a small, tight smile. Liam looked like he was about to be sick. The walk to the front of the room was the longest of her life. Every footstep echoed in the suddenly silent classroom. She could feel the collective gaze of her classmates, a heavy, physical weight. Their faces were a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and outright boredom. They were expecting a train wreck. She took her place at the podium, Noah to her side at the computer. Liam standing slightly behind them with a stack of note cards he was gripping so tightly his knuckles were white. Amara's hands trembled as she arranged her own cards. Her throat was dry, From the corner of her eye, she saw it again. The shadow in the corner wasn't just a trick of the light anymore. It was a presence, a deep well of cold and silence that seemed to suck the very warmth and sound out of the room. A low, insidious whisper slithered into her mind, a serpent of pure doubt. They're all waiting for you to fail. You are nothing. Your little friends will abandon you. You are alone, she faltered, her breath catching in her throat. The words on her note cards swam before her eyes. The cold was overwhelming, a paralyzing wave of despair. She was going to fail. The shadow was going to win. Then, she felt a warmth on her back. She glanced behind her. Liam, despite his own terror, had taken a half step forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a small, trembling gesture, but it was an anchor in the freezing storm of her fear. At the same time, Noah met her eyes from across the podium. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was one of fierce, unwavering solidarity. He tapped his fingers on the laptop, a silent signal. I'm here, we're here. The connection, it was still there. The whisper in her head receded, hissing in frustration. Amara took a deep breath. She looked out at the sea of faces, at Jake's smug smirk and Chloe's analytical gaze. She slipped her free hand into her pocket, and this time, when her fingers found the whirring stone, it was no longer cool. A deep, steady warmth pulsed from it, a quiet thrum of ancient energy. It felt like holding a small, sleeping sun. The warmth spread up her arm, chasing away the last of the unnatural chill. The words on her note cards came back into focus. She knew what she had to do. Our presentation, she began, her voice clearer and stronger than she'd expected, is about the old mill down by the river. Noah clicked, and the first slide appeared. It was a black and white photo of a stately, functional building, a water wheel at its side. For over 100 years, she continued, sticking to the script for now. It wasn't just a place to grind grain. It was the heart of the town. It was a landmark, not just because of what it was, but because of what happened there. People met there, they talked, they traded news. They built a community around it. She talked for a few minutes about the mill's history, the families who owned it, the way it shaped the local economy. She could feel the class settling into a state of resigned boredom. This was just another dry, historical report. Jake was openly scrolling on his phone. Then came the pivot. Noah switched to a new slide. It was a photo of the mill as it was today, a ruin. The roof had caved in, the windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in graffiti. The water wheel was a tangle of rotting wood. But 100 years of history ain't what makes a place important, Amara said, pushing her note cards to the side. She was going off script now. Liam looked startled, but he didn't move his hand from her shoulder. What makes a place important is the connections it represents. When the mill was abandoned, it wasn't just a building that was lost. The town lost a center, a place where everyone, no matter who they were, had a reason to be. The connection started to break. A few students looked up from their phones. Mr. Harrison leaned forward, a frown on his face. This wasn't in their proposal. We don't have a mill anymore, Amara said, her voice gaining power as the truth of her own words filled her. We have other things. We have hallways and cafeterias and classrooms. We have places where we all are, but we're not always together. She took a risk and looked directly at Jake. His head was up now, his smirk gone, replaced by a look of wary confusion. We build walls, she said, her voice echoing the words she'd spoken in English class, but this time they weren't about a poem. They were about all of them. We build them with jokes we only tell to a few people. We build them with rumors. We build them by looking away when someone needs help. We build them by deciding who's in and who's out. And every time we build a wall, the space between us gets colder. It gets darker. The cold from the corner of the room seemed to surge forward, as if in answer to her words. The projector flickered violently. A girl in the front row gasped. The whisper returned to Amara's mind, no longer a suggestion, but a furious command. Stop. They will hate you for this. Stop talking. But the warmth from the stone in her pocket was a bonfire now, and the steady pressure of Liam's hand, the look in Noah's eyes, they were an unbreakable shield. She would not stop. Noah, sensing the shift, stood up from the computer. "Those empty spaces," he said, his voice joining hers, "they get filled with other things, with doubt, with loneliness, with the feeling that you're invisible." He looked around the room, his gaze resting for a moment on the quiet kids, the ones who always sat alone, the ones who had never been invited to a party. He was speaking their language, he was telling their story. "It makes you feel like you're the problem," Liam added, his voice quiet but miraculously steady. He finally let go of Amara's shoulder and took a step forward, joining them. The three of them stood together, a united front. "It makes you think you're not good enough, or smart enough, or whatever enough, and it's a lie." The projector flickered again and died, plunging the front of the room into shadow. Mr. Harrison yelped in surprise. A nervous titter ran through the class. The entity was fighting back, trying to reclaim the darkness. The cold was a physical presence now, pressing in on them, a suffocating blanket of despair. "It's a lie," Amara said, her voice rising to be heard over the murmurs. She pulled the whirring stone from her pocket. She wasn't thinking, just acting. She held it up. In the dim light of the classroom, the stone began to glow. It started as a soft, internal luminescence, as if a firefly were trapped inside. Gasps rippled through the room. The nervous laughter died. Everyone was staring at the small, glowing object in her hand.